12:47 p.m., August 8, 1944. A 21-year-old boy from a shoe factory pulled the trigger. 800 yards away, a 57-ton steel fortress erupted into a fireball visible for 3 miles. The turret, 11 tons of solid German armor, was hurled 30 feet into the air like a tin can. Inside that burning wreck lay the most feared tank commander in the entire Third Reich. The man Adolf Hitler had personally decorated. The man Joseph Goebbels had called the perfect German warrior. Dead. Killed by someone who had never fired a tank gun in actual combat before that afternoon. Not killed by an airstrike. Not killed by superior numbers. Killed by one Sherman. One crew. One gunner who 2 years earlier had been stitching leather soles in a factory in Northamptonshire. In 12 minutes, Trooper Joe Eakins destroyed 3 Tiger tanks, the most feared armored vehicles on the planet. And in doing so, he ended the legend of Michael Wittmann. The tank ace the German war machine said was impossible to stop. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss our next video. Join us as we continue uncovering the most gripping stories, events, and moments of inspiration from history's most dramatic chapters. This community is built for people who believe the real stories are always more extraordinary than the myths, and we are just getting started. But before we get to that burning field in Normandy, before we get to the moment a young man from the English Midlands did something the entire German military said could not be done, we need to understand exactly what kind of monster Joe Eakins was sitting across that wheat field from. And we need to understand why in the summer of 1944 the name Michael Wittmann made Allied tank crews go pale. By the summer of 1944, the German Tiger tank had achieved something almost no weapon in the history of warfare had ever achieved. It had become a psychological weapon more powerful than the physical steel it was made from. Allied tank commanders were not just afraid of Tigers. They were terrified of them in a way that bordered on paralysis. Veterans from Normandy describe the experience in words that sound almost unbelievable today. Men would hear the distinctive deep boom of an 88mm gun and freeze. Drivers would stop their tanks in the middle of open ground. Commanders would refuse to advance. Not because they were cowards, these were men who had crossed the English Channel under fire, who had stormed beaches with artillery falling around them. They froze because they had watched what a Tiger did to a Sherman. At normal battlefield ranges, the standard Sherman's 75mm gun could not penetrate a Tiger's frontal armor. Full stop. Crews knew this. They had been told it in training. They had watched it happen in the field. A Sherman gunner would identify a Tiger line, up a perfect shot, pull the trigger, and watch the round bounce off the thick German steel like a pebble off a castle wall. Then the Tiger would turn its turret slowly, almost casually, and fire back, and the Sherman would explode. The nickname Allied crews had given their own tanks tells you everything you need to know about morale in those months. They called them Ronsons. After the cigarette lighter, because they lit first time every time. Into this atmosphere of fear and attrition came Michael Wittmann, and the German propaganda machine turned him into something close to a god of war. His official kill tally, by the time he reached Normandy, stood at somewhere between 135 and 143 enemy armored vehicles destroyed, depending on which German source you consulted. Historians today note that these numbers almost certainly included unit kills, credited to the commander, rather than purely personal shots, a common practice in the German military. But even discounting the propaganda inflation, the core record was extraordinary. Wittmann was genuinely skilled, genuinely aggressive, and genuinely dangerous in a way that went beyond what most tank commanders ever achieved. He had been born on April 22, 1914, in the tiny Bavarian village of Vogeltal, the son of a farmer. There was nothing in his early life that suggested a future of armored warfare and newsreel fame. He was quiet, unremarkable. A rural southern German boy who joined the army in 1934, transferred to the SS in 1936, and found himself assigned to the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, the elite personal guard division of the Nazi leader, by April of 1937. He participated in the annexation of Austria, the occupation of the Sudetenland, the invasion of Poland. He fought in France in the Balkans, and then on the Eastern Front when Germany turned east in June 1941. It was in Russia that Wittmann discovered what he was. The vast open steppes of the Soviet Union were perfect terrain for the kind of tank warfare he excelled at long-range engagements where the Tiger's 88mm gun could reach out and kill at distances where the enemy simply could not shoot back. He transitioned to the Tiger I in early 1943 and began building the kill record that would eventually make him famous. At Kursk, in July 1943, the largest tank battle in history, he fought through the massive clashes around Prokhorovka. By January 1944, his divisional commander presented him with the Knight's Cross. By the end of that month, he had the Oak Leaves. Adolf Hitler personally pinned decorations on his chest at the Wolf's Lair. Joseph Goebbels put his face on magazine covers and newsreels across Germany. The message was simple and deliberately calculated. One German tank commander was worth 100 enemy tanks. The Tiger was invincible. Men like Wittmann made Germany unbeatable. And then came Villers-Bocage, and the legend became something almost mythological. On the morning of June 13, 1944, just 1 week after D-Day, the British 7th Armored Division, the legendary Desert Rats, was advancing through what appeared to be a gap in the German lines near the small Norman town of Villers-Bocage. The forward squadron of the 4th County of London Yeomanry pushed through the town and halted on a ridge to the east. The crews dismounted. Some brewed tea. Half-tracks and carriers of the Rifle Brigade were strung out along the road behind them in a long, exposed column. Nobody expected trouble. Wittmann's company, at roughly half strength with only 5 or 6 operational Tigers, was concealed in a wood just south of that road. He had arrived the previous evening and was completely surprised by the British advance. There was no time to coordinate. He later said he believed the British had already spotted him and would destroy him where he sat. So he did something that by any rational military calculation was suicidal. He pulled out alone in a single Tiger, emerged onto the road behind the British column, and drove west along it, firing as he went. What followed was one of the most shocking 15 minutes in the history of armored warfare. Vehicle after vehicle erupted in flames. Half-tracks, carriers, scout cars, Cromwell tanks, the Tiger's 88 tore through them without slowing. Men scrambled into hedgerows. A 6-pounder anti-tank gun crew tried to engage and was destroyed before they could fire effectively. By the time Wittmann's Tiger was finally disabled entering the town itself, possibly by a concealed Firefly or a 6-pounder at a junction, he and his battalion had wrecked most of an armored regiment's forward elements. Operation Perch, the attempt to outflank Caen from the southwest, was finished. The German propaganda machine went into overdrive. Photographs were staged. Numbers were inflated. At least one composite image published in Signal magazine was doctored to exaggerate the destruction. The legend of Wittmann at Villers-Bocage became the kind of story that felt too dramatic to be entirely true, because parts of it weren't. Historians, including John Buckley, have documented how later German counterattack forces involving Panzer IVs and other Tiger crews were folded into the Wittmann narrative to make one man seem responsible for everything. But the factual core was damning enough. In his initial attack alone, he had done something extraordinary. He received the swords to his Knight's Cross. He was promoted. He became the most famous tank commander in the German military. And Allied tank crews across Normandy, already frightened, became more frightened. Now understand what this meant for the men who had to fight him. It is August 1944. You are a British or Canadian tanker. You have been fighting in Normandy for 2 months. You have watched friends die in burning Shermans. You have been told your gun cannot penetrate a Tiger from the front. You have heard the name Wittmann. You have possibly seen the newsreel footage, the magazine covers, the propaganda existed in captured form, and in the stories soldiers told each other at night. The psychological weight of that reputation was a weapon in itself, and the Germans knew it. Into this landscape of fear and exhaustion and attrition, Operation Totalize was launched. By early August, the wider situation in Normandy had shifted dramatically. The Americans had broken out at Avranches between July 25th and 31st in Operation Cobra. General Patton's forces were sweeping east and south in a massive encirclement. To keep maximum German armor pinned in the Caen sector and prevent it redeploying against the Americans, Field Marshal Montgomery ordered the 1st Canadian Army to drive south down the Caen to Falaise Road. The objective was the high ground north of Falaise, the first stage of what would become the Falaise Pocket, one of the most catastrophic encirclements of the entire war. Lieutenant General Guy Simons, commanding the 2nd Canadian Corps, was the man tasked with making it happen, and Simons was not a conventional thinker. The ground south of Caen was open rolling farmland, with almost no cover-perfect killing ground for German 88mm guns dug into concealed positions. Every previous daylight advance across this terrain had ended in catastrophe. Tanks would crest a gentle ridge and find themselves in a shooting gallery, burning before they could even locate the guns destroying them. A conventional daytime assault down the Falaise Road was not a plan. It was a massacre waiting to be organized. So Simons proposed something the textbooks had never described: a night armored attack. 6 dense columns of tanks and infantry advancing in total darkness behind a massive strike by over 1,000 RAF, Lancaster and Halifax bombers, guided through the featureless black landscape by radio direction finders, artillery marker shells, and Bofors 40mm tracer rounds fired continuously down the axis of advance like luminous rails in the night sky. And because infantry could not keep pace with tanks on foot in darkness across broken ground, Simons solved that problem with an improvisation that military historians still discuss today. He ordered 76 obsolete M7 Priest self-propelled guns, stripped of their 105mm guns, the openings welded shut with armor salvaged from landing craft hulks on the Normandy beaches, and converted into fully tracked armored troop carriers. The work was completed near Bayeux by August 6th. A major named Gil Pointer christened them kangaroos because the infantry would ride in the mother's pouch. They were the first purpose-modified armored personnel carriers ever used in combat. The attack went in at 11 p.m. on August 7th. Over 1,000 heavy bombers struck German positions on both flanks of a 4-mile corridor. The ground shook. Dust and smoke rose thousands of feet. At 11:30, the armored columns rolled forward behind a creeping barrage. The noise was something veterans described for the rest of their lives: engines and artillery, and the crump of bombs, and the rattle of tracks on hard Norman earths, all blending into something that stopped being separate sounds and became a single physical force pressing against the body. Phase 1 worked. By dawn on August 8th, Allied forces had driven several kilometers into the German defensive zone. The 51st Highland Division had dismounted from kangaroos within 200 yards of the villages of Cramsnil and Saint-Aignan de Cramsnil, and overrun them in fierce close-quarters fighting. The Verrières Ridge, which German units had held for weeks against everything thrown at it, fell by noon. Then Simons paused. Artillery needed to be brought forward. A second bombing strike by the American 8th Air Force was scheduled for around midday to hit positions further south around Cintho. Allied tanks sat in orchards and farmyards around Saint-Aignan waiting. And into that pause, that operational gap between phases, came the German counterattack. And at the tip of that counterattack was Michael Wittmann, commanding the available Tigers of Schweer SS Panzerabteilung 101, because the regular battalion commander was hospitalized. He had 8 serviceable Tigers. The Allies had roughly 600 armored vehicles committed to totalize. His usual tank was under repair. He was using the battalion commander's vehicle Tiger 007. With a crew, he had hand-picked 5 young men whose average age was just over 20 years old. The 1st Northamptonshire Yeomanry had taken Saint-Aignan during the night advance. A squadron and C squadron moved into the Bois de Lalonde orchard area, a belt of trees overlooking 800 to 1,200 yards of open ground toward the road and Cintho. 3 Troop of A Squadron under Lieutenant James was positioned on the western edge of the wood. Their anti-armor asset was a single Sherman Firefly commanded by Sergeant Gordon. And in that Firefly at the gun sat Trooper Joe Eakins, 21 years old, his first day firing a tank gun in combat. A boy from a shoe factory who had never done this before. He could see the Tigers moving north through the summer haze, dark, angular shapes trailing dust. He pressed his eye to the gun sight. He waited for the order. At the same moment, 1 mile to the west, Major Sidney Radley Walters' A Squadron of the Sherbrooke Fusiliers was hidden inside the stone walls of the Chateau of Gomerville, firing loopholes broken through the perimeter wall, their Shermans facing east, directly broadside to any German movement along the road. Michael Wittmann was driving his Tigers straight into a crossfire, and he didn't know it. What happened in the next 12 minutes would end. The legend exposed the propaganda and proved something the German High Command refused to believe, that ordinary men in ordinary machines given the right weapon and the right position and the discipline to wait could kill anything. Even a ghost, even a myth, even the greatest tank ace the Third Reich had ever produced. In Part 2, we go inside those 12 minutes, second by second. We find out exactly what Joe Ekins saw through that gun sight, what rounds he fired, and what happened inside Tiger 007 when the shot that ended everything finally struck home. We examine the forensic evidence, the survivor testimony, and the decades-long debate over which gun actually fired the fatal round. And we ask the question that reframes everything: was Michael Wittmann killed by genius, or by the one thing no amount of legend could protect against, the right man, the right machine, the right moment? 12 minutes, 3 Tigers, 1 gunner who had never fired a tank gun in combat before that afternoon. In Part 1, we watched Joe Ekins climb into a Sherman Firefly on the morning of August 8, 1944, a 21-year-old shoe factory worker from Northamptonshire sitting behind the most powerful Allied tank gun in Normandy. We watched Michael Wittmann, the most decorated Panzer ace in the Third Reich, the man Hitler personally decorated, the legend Goebbels built into a propaganda god, drive his Tigers north across open ground towards Saint-Aignan-de-Cramesnil. And we left the story at the moment Ekins pressed his eye to the gun sight, the Tigers closing to 800 yards, the order not yet given. Now we go inside those 12 minutes. But first understand what was at stake in this single engagement. By August 8, 1944, Schwer SS Panzerabteilung 101 had arrived in Normandy with approximately 45 Tigers. On that morning, Wittmann could field exactly 8. The Germans could not replace Tiger losses faster than they were losing them. Every Tiger destroyed was irreplaceable in any practical sense. And Wittmann himself, the propaganda investment the Reich had made in his image, the morale value of his continued survival, was worth more to the German war machine than the steel of any tank. When he drove north towards Saint-Aignan that afternoon, he was not just risking 8 Tigers. He was risking something the Reich could not afford to lose at all. SS Standartenführer Kurt Meyer had personally briefed Wittmann at Saint-Ouen. The plan was to push north on both sides of the Caen to Falaise Road, retake the high ground around Saint-Aignan that the Allies had seized during the night advance, and disrupt the second phase of Totalize before the American bombers arrived to support it. Meyer was a ferociously aggressive commander. His men called him Panzer Meyer, and his orders that morning had the character of a man who believed momentum could substitute for arithmetic. 20 Panzer IVs, a battalion of SS Grenadiers, 8 Tigers, against 600 Allied armored vehicles. A fellow officer. Hans Huflinger later recorded that Wittmann told the assembled commanders before they moved out that he had to go forward himself because the recently promoted 3rd Company commander lacked the battlefield experience to lead the attack alone. It was the statement of a man who understood his own reputation had become an obligation. He could not send others into an attack he would not lead. That was who Michael Wittmann was. It was also on August 8, 1944, exactly the wrong instinct. He left Saint-Ouen between 12:20 and 12:30 in the afternoon. Tiger 007 moved north. Alongside him, Signals Officer Helmut Dollinger, in command, Tank 009. Behind them, Tiger 312, commanded by SS Obersturmführer Peter Kiesters, and Tiger 314. On the west side of the road, 3 more tigers advanced under Hoflinger, and others, with the inexperienced Herrick, held further back in reserve. The formation moved across open ground, trailing dust in the August heat completely exposed. They had no idea what was waiting for them. In the Bois de Lalande orchard on the eastern side of the road, Lieutenant James of 3 Troop A Squadron. 1st Northamptonshire. Yeomanry watched the tigers appear through his binoculars. He had 4 vehicles. 3 standard Shermans with 75mm guns weapons he knew could not penetrate a tiger frontally at any practical range. And 1 Firefly, 1 gun that could actually fight what was coming toward him. He got on the radio to his squadron commander. He kept his crews in cover. He waited. Joe Eakins, sitting behind the 17-pounder in the Firefly's turret, could see them now. Dark shapes in the haze moving north in a loose column, growing larger as they closed the distance. He would later describe the moment with the blunt economy of a man who had processed the memory many thousands of times across many decades. He saw them. He identified them. He waited for the order. That was the job. That was all of it. At approximately 12:47 p.m., Lieutenant James gave the order. Target the rearmost tiger. Eakins pressed the firing pedal. Bishi. The 17-pounder fired with a concussion that physically moved the air inside the turret. 800 yards across the wheat field, the round struck Tiger 3-1-2. Keister's tank shuddered under the impact. Eakins loaded again the Firefly's reload procedure, requiring the gunner to assist the loader, given the length of the 17-pounder ammunition, and fired a second round. Tiger 3-1-2 erupted in flames. The first kill took less than 30 seconds. The surviving tigers reacted. German tank commanders were trained to identify and eliminate Fireflies first, specifically because of the threat posed by the 17-pounder. The distinctive long barrel was the giveaway. Return fire came almost immediately. A round from one of the tigers struck the Firefly's turret. Sergeant Gordon, the vehicle commander, was hit wounded by fragments or incapacitated by the impact. Accounts differ on the specifics. The crew bailed out. For a moment, the Firefly sat without a commander. Lieutenant James ran across open ground under fire, climbed into the Firefly, and took the commander's position. Read that again. He ran across open ground, under direct fire from Tiger tanks, climbed into a vehicle that had just been struck by an 88mm round. Because the alternative was losing the only gun in his troop capable of killing what was coming at them. Eakins had not moved from the gunner's seat. The Firefly moved. It nosed out from the orchard's edge, acquired a second target, and fired. The round struck home. What followed was not the standard penetration and internal fire that tankers called a brew-up. This was something categorically different. The second Tiger almost certainly. Tiger 009 Dollinger's command tank detonated. The explosion was enormous. A sympathetic detonation of the onboard 88mm ammunition, a catastrophic chain reaction that released the energy of dozens of propellant charges and warheads simultaneously. Eakins later said the fireball was unlike anything he had seen before or after. He knew watching it that no one inside had survived. The Firefly reversed back into the orchard, repositioned, moved out again along a slightly different line to deny the surviving German crews a fixed aiming point. Eakins found his third target in the gun sight. He fired. Tiger 314 was hit. Another kill. The first Northamptonshire Yeomanry War Diary, written in pencil on the evening of August 8th, recorded the 3 destroyed Tigers as numbers 312007 and 314. The time elapsed from first shot to third kill, approximately 12 minutes. On the western side of the road, at almost exactly the same moment, Major Sidney Radley Walters had been holding his Sherbrooke Fusiliers on a tight leash. His A squadron was hidden inside the stone perimeter walls of the Chateau of Gomerville, firing loopholes broken through the ancient masonry, their Shermans, and at least one Firefly facing east in a perfect broadside position to anything moving north along the road. The range was somewhere between 150 and 500 meters, depending on the source close enough that even a standard 75mm Sherman had a fighting chance against Tiger side armor. Radley Walters had been calling it on the radio as the Tigers approached. Hold off, let them come. Wait until they are inside the kill zone. Then he gave the order. The lead Tiger nearest the chateau was struck and stopped dead within seconds. The Sherbrouks destroyed a self-propelled gun, at least one further Tiger, and 2 Panzer IVs in the minutes that followed. The German attack had driven into a crossfire it could not see from either flank, set up independently by 2 Allied units who had not coordinated the trap. They had simply both found good ground and held discipline. Inside Tiger 007. In those final seconds, Michael Wittmann faced a situation the Russian steppe had never prepared him for. The engagement distances in Russia had been vast. The Tigers 88 could reach out and kill at ranges where return fire was ineffective. Here in Normandy, the distances were 300 meters, 500 meters, 800 meters. The terrain that had seemed open was studded with orchards and stone walls and farm buildings that hid Allied guns until the moment they fired. There was no long-range duel to be fought. There was only the killing ground, and he was in it. Huflinger positioned to Wittmann's rear right in his own Tiger reported by radio at approximately 12:55 p.m. that Tiger 007 had stopped moving. The turret was skewed to the right and tilted forward. He heard Wittmann's last radio transmission. The words were clipped urgent, the voice of a man processing information faster than he could speak it. Anti-tank guns to the right. Attention, anti-tank guns to the right. Pull back. Then silence. Shortly afterward, a catastrophic internal explosion blew the turret completely off Tiger 007's hull. The 11-ton steel structure was hurled several meters from the vehicle. Battalion Medical Officer Dr. Wolfgang Rabe witnessed it personally and described it in a letter to Hildegard Wittmann written after the war. The propellant charges for the onboard 88mm ammunition had cooked off in sequence, each detonation triggering the next, the pressure building until the turret ring failed and the turret became a projectile. Every tank crew who fought in the Second World War knew what this looked like. They called it the Jack-in-the-Box. When it happened, death inside the tank was instantaneous. There was no surviving it. All 5 men in Tiger 007 were killed. Michael Wittmann, 30 years old. Karl Wagner, 24. Gunther Weber, 19. Heinrich Reimers, 20. Rudolf Herschel, 20. 5 men whose average age was barely 23, gone in a fraction of a second. By the end of the engagement, 5 of the 7 Tigers in Wittmann's attack force had been destroyed. The counterattack that Meyer and Waldmüller had thrown together in desperation was broken in less than 30 minutes. Operation Totalize continued. The Falaise Road remained in Allied hands. Now comes the question that historians have argued about ever since, and it matters more than it might seem. Which gun actually fired the round that killed Wittmann? The first Northamptonshire Yeomanry War Diary lists Tiger 007 as Eakins' third kill. Historian Stephen Hart endorsed this identification through the 1990s, and it became the accepted version for decades. But in 2005, retired Lieutenant Colonel Brian Reed published a forensic reanalysis of the wreck evidence. Reed argued that the single fatal penetration on Tiger 007 struck the left side of the hull, the side facing the Sherbrooke Fusiliers to the west. Eakins' position to the northeast would logically have produced a strike on the right side. The geometry pointed away from the Firefly and toward the Sherbrooks. The reconciliation most historians now favor is that Eakins genuinely destroyed 3 Tigers in 12 minutes, but the third tank he engaged, the one the War Diary calls 007, may actually have been Tiger 009, Dollinger's command vehicle, which carried a similarly formatted number. The real Tiger 007 carrying Wittmann was most likely killed by a Sherbrooke Fusilier Sherman at almost the same moment in the chaos of the crossfire. The Sherbrooke Fusiliers' own records cannot confirm this independently. Their headquarters half-track and most operational documents were destroyed that same afternoon by a stray American bomb from the 8th Air Force strike. the same bombers sent to support Totalize accidentally hitting Allied positions in one of the war's more bitter ironies. What is beyond all forensic dispute is this. Michael Wittmann was killed by ground fire from Allied tanks. He was not killed by an RAF Typhoon rocket strike, which is the version the SS propaganda apparatus circulated at the time to protect the myth of Tiger invincibility. The official German line was that a hero like Wittmann could acceptably fall to overwhelming Allied air power and impersonal, almost elemental force. He could not be seen to have been outshot by a Sherman, the tank the German military had spent years calling a burning coffin. The tank crewed by factory workers and farmhands and shoe-stitchers from English market towns. The propaganda lie held for years, but the ground truth was simpler and more devastating. Two Allied tank units operating independently, with discipline and patience, and the right weapon in the right position, had destroyed the most celebrated armored force the Third Reich could field in 15 minutes of coordinated fire. They had done it without knowing Wittmann was there. They had done it without any special preparation beyond basic fire discipline and the willingness to hold position until the enemy was inside the kill zone. Joe Ekins went home after the war. He went back to Rushton, back to the shoe factory. He never claimed to have killed Wittmann personally. He said only what the war diary said, that he had destroyed 3 Tigers, one of which was logged as 007. When asked about Wittmann's reputation, his answer was characteristically direct. Wittmann had accepted Hitler's doctrine enough to get in his tank and invade other people's countries. He might have been a hero to the Germans. He was not a hero to Joe Ekins. The legend was over. But the questions it raised about the Tiger's true invincibility, about what the Sherman could actually do when properly armed and properly positioned, about the gap between propaganda and battlefield reality, those questions were only beginning to be answered. Because what happened near Saint-Aignan on August 8th was not an isolated incident. It was the proof of a principle, and in Part 3, we examine what that principle cost Germany across the entire Normandy campaign, what the true Tiger loss rate revealed about the myth of mechanical supremacy, and why the ordinary men who crewed Allied tanks were never the inferior soldiers the Reich needed the world to believe they were. The Tiger was not invincible. The question now was whether Germany would realize it in time. And the answer to that question would decide the fate of an entire army. 12 minutes. 3 Tigers. 1 shoe factory worker from Northamptonshire. In Parts 1 and 2, we watched Joe Ekins destroy 3 Tiger tanks on August 8, 1944, almost certainly killing Michael Wittmann in the process, the most decorated panzer ace in the Third Reich, dead in a crossfire he never saw coming. We examined the forensic debate over which gun fired the fatal round. We went inside the final seconds of Tiger 007, and we left with a question hanging in the air, not about who killed Wittmann, but about what his death actually meant. Because here is the number that reframes everything. By August 8, 1944, Germany had lost over 500 tanks in Normandy in just 2 months of fighting. The Tiger, the weapon Goebbels had called invincible, had a combat loss rate in Normandy of nearly 90% of all deployed vehicles. And yet Allied tank crews were still afraid of them, still hesitating, still dying and burning Shermans, because the myth of the Tiger had outlasted the reality of what the Tiger could actually do when properly countered. The death of Wittmann did not end that myth overnight, but it cracked it, and what followed would finish the job. The German High Command's reaction to Wittmann's death was not grief. It was panic wrapped in bureaucratic silence. For over a week, Schwer SS Panzerabteilung 101 officially listed him as missing in action. The battalion could not confirm the death because no one had been able to approach the burning wreck. The open ground around Tiger 007 was swept by Allied observation and fire throughout August 8th and the days that followed. Dr. Wolfgang Rabe, the battalion's medical officer, had watched the turret blow from a distance. He knew. But knowing and confirming were different things in an army that depended on the legend of Michael Wittmann to sustain morale across an entire theater of war. When the death was finally announced through SS press channels, the official explanation was deliberate and calculated. Wittmann had fallen to enemy fighter bombers, the dreaded Jabos, the Allied ground attack aircraft that had made daytime movement on Norman roads almost impossible. This was a lie the SS constructed consciously, and the reasoning behind it reveals everything about how the German military understood propaganda as a weapon. A Tiger ace killed by air power was acceptable. Air power was impersonal, overwhelming, almost impossible to defend against. It required no individual failure. It assigned no blame. It preserved the myth of the Tiger's ground invincibility intact. But a Tiger ace killed by a Sherman, the tank German propaganda had spent 3 years calling a rolling coffin, a burning death trap, an inferior machine crewed by inferior men. That was a story that could not be told. Not in August 1944. Not when the Falaise pocket was forming around an entire German army. The broader German Panzer Command, however, could not hide from the arithmetic. In the week following August 8th, the remnants of Schwer SS Panzerabteilung 101 were effectively destroyed as a fighting unit. Of the 45 Tigers that had entered Normandy with the battalion, fewer than 5 remained operational by mid-August. Not all were killed by Fireflies. Artillery airstrikes, mechanical breakdown, and abandonment accounted for a significant portion. But the pattern was clear, and it terrified German tank commanders who understood what they were seeing. The Firefly had changed the equation. Wherever Allied tank troops held fire discipline and placed their Fireflies in covered positions, Tigers were dying. The standing German order to identify and kill Fireflies, first recognizable by the long 17-pounder barrel, was being followed, but Allied crews had adapted. Camouflage schemes broke up the barrel's silhouette. Some crews mounted dummy barrels to confuse German observers. The Firefly was learning to hide, and a hidden Firefly was lethal. German intelligence reports from late July and August 1944 documented the shift with uncharacteristic candor. One report noted that Allied armor had developed a system of combined concealment and long-range engagement that negated the Tiger's traditional advantages. Another noted that Firefly-equipped troops were achieving first-round hits at ranges of 800 to 1,200 meters against Tiger frontal armor with unacceptable frequency. The psychological impact on German crews was documented separately. Veterans who had fought in Russia were filing reports describing a new hesitation in their crews, a reluctance to advance against positions that might conceal a Firefly, a tendency to halt and probe rather than push through. The boldness that had defined German panzer tactics since 1940 was eroding one burning Tiger at a time. But the crisis was not only German. Within the Allied command, the Firefly's success was generating its own complications. Production of the 17-pounder conversion was running at roughly 1 Firefly per troop, one capable gun for every 3 vehicles that could not reliably kill heavy German armor. Field commanders were requesting more. The conversion program at workshops in Britain was operating at capacity, but the bottleneck was not fabrication. It was the 17-pounder ammunition supply chain. The gun consumed different propellant charges and shell casings than the standard 75mm rounds used by the rest of the Sherman fleet, and forward logistics units were repeatedly failing to deliver adequate stocks to frontline troops. At least 2 documented engagements in late July and early August saw Fireflies forced to disengage because their crews had expended their 17-pounder rounds and could not be resupplied under fire. There were also voices within the British armored establishment arguing that the Firefly was being misused, that concentrating 1 per troop dispersed its impact, and that Firefly-equipped troops should be grouped together for mass engagements rather than spread across every squadron. The debate was real, and it was unresolved. Some regimental commanders were implementing their own informal concentration tactics. Others were following doctrine. The result was inconsistency at the unit level at exactly the moment when consistency mattered most. Then came the Falaise pocket, and everything changed. By August 13, 1944, the strategic encirclement that Operation Totalize had helped enable was becoming visible to everyone with a map. American forces under General Patton had swung north from Argentan. Canadian and Polish forces were driving south from Caen. Between them, trapped in a corridor of Norman countryside, centered on the town of Falaise, were the remnants of two German armies, Army Group B's fighting strength in the west, somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 men with their tanks, artillery, and transport. The Germans called what followed the Kessel the Cauldron. On August 14th, the second phase of Totalize gave way to Operation Tractable, the Canadian push to close the southern jaw of the encirclement. The 4th Canadian Armored Division and the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division pushed south through terrain. The German 12th SS Panzer Division and scattered elements of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps were still contesting with everything they had left. What remained of German armor in the pocket Panthers Panzer IVs, the handful of surviving Tigers from multiple battalions, was fighting not to hold ground, but to keep the corridor out open long enough for the infantry to escape. This was the battlefield context in which the Firefly doctrine proven at Saint-Aignan on August 8th was tested at operational scale. On August 14th, near the village of Quesnay Wood, south of Caen, a squadron of the 1st Northamptonshire Yeomanry, the same regiment that had put Joe Atkins behind the gun 6 days earlier, engaged a mixed force of Panthers and Panzer IVs, attempting to hold a blocking position on a ridgeline. The German position was tactically sound. Hull-down Panthers with their 75mm long-barrel guns covering a shallow valley. Frontally, they were essentially impervious to standard Sherman fire. In the previous weeks, a similar position had stopped a Canadian armored advance cold for 6 hours. This time it lasted 40 minutes. The squadron commander positioned his Fireflies on the flanks first. 2 vehicles working around the right edge of the wood line, 1 vehicle pushing left through a dead ground fold in the terrain that German observers had not identified. The standard Shermans advanced down the center, not to kill Panthers, but to draw their attention to make the German gunners rotate their turrets and commit to targets in front, while the Fireflies worked the angles. The 1st Panther was hit on its right flank at approximately 900 meters. The 17-pounder round punched through the side armor, and the tank stopped. Burning. The German crews and the remaining Panthers identified the muzzle flash and began to rotate. The center Shermans accelerated, closed the range, forced the German gunners to choose. A 2nd Panther was struck from the left flank at 600 meters. It did not burn immediately. The round went through the engine compartment, and the crew bailed before the fire caught, but it was out of the fight. A 3rd Panther reversed off the ridgeline and was caught in the open by the right flank Firefly at 1,100 meters. Hit once. Hit twice. Stopped. The blocking position collapsed in 40 minutes. 3 Panthers destroyed or abandoned. 2 Panzer IVs knocked out by standard Sherman fire when they broke cover to reposition. The Canadian infantry following behind the armor moved through the position before German reserves could organize a response. Quesnay Wood fell. The road south remained open for the encirclement to close. A German after-action report captured later described the engagement with the kind of clinical honesty that senior German commanders occasionally permitted themselves when the audience was internal. The report noted that the Allied armor had demonstrated a coordinated fire plan that denied the defensive position any effective countermeasure. It specifically identified the presence of long-barreled tank guns, meaning 17-pounders on both flanks, as the decisive factor. It recommended that future defensive positions be sighted to prevent flank exposure. It did not explain how to do this when the Allied force was larger, more mobile, and better supplied. By August 21, 1944, the Falaise pocket was closed. German estimates of losses inside the pocket ranged from 10,000 killed to 50,000 captured, with figures varying significantly by source. The materiel losses were staggering and almost impossible to replace approximately 500 tanks and assault guns, 1,500 artillery pieces, 20,000 vehicles of all types. 2 German armies had been effectively destroyed as coherent fighting forces. The campaign in France was over in any meaningful sense. What remained was pursuit delay and the long retreat to the German border. The Firefly had not won the Battle of Normandy alone. No single weapon wins battles alone. But the 17-pounder conversion had changed something fundamental in the calculus of the armored engagement. It had given Allied tank troops a gun that could fight German heavy armor on honest terms. And in doing so, it had forced a change in German tactical behavior that compounded across every engagement. German Panthers and Tigers that had once advanced confidently into Allied positions now hesitated. That hesitation cost seconds. Seconds cost positions. Positions cost battles. And the accumulation of lost battles cost Germany France. The numbers from the Normandy campaign tell the story without embellishment. In the 2 months between D-Day and the closing of the Falaise Pocket, the Wehrmacht and SS lost approximately 2,200 tanks and assault guns in the Western Theater. Allied tank losses were significant too, roughly 4,000 vehicles across all Allied nations, but the crucial difference was replacement. American factories were producing Sherman tanks at a rate that meant every Allied loss could be replaced within weeks. Germany could not replace its losses at all in any operationally meaningful time frame. The quality gap that the Tiger and Panther represented had been a genuine advantage when the numbers were small. At scale, in an attrition campaign against an enemy with vastly greater industrial capacity, that quality advantage was being ground away one engagement at a time. Joe Ekins went back to his regiment after August 8th. He was reassigned as a wireless operator, never fired a tank gun in combat again for the rest of the war. He crossed the Rhine in March 1945 in an LVT-4 Buffalo amphibious vehicle. He was demobilized as a trooper. No medal for the Tigers. No formal recognition that he had almost certainly killed the most famous tank commander in the German military. The regimental war diary entry was the only official acknowledgement. 3 Tigers in 12 minutes is not bad business. But there is a final chapter to this story that most accounts stop short of examining. What happened to the men who built the Firefly? What happened to the doctrine that had been called insane when it was first proposed? The idea that you could take an American medium tank and mount a gun powerful enough to kill a Tiger. Who were the engineers and planners who made the conversion work under wartime pressure with limited resources? And what does the Firefly story tell us about the gap between the weapons a military is comfortable with and the weapons it actually needs? That story involves decisions made years before Normandy, arguments that were lost and then won too late, and at least one man who spent 2 years being told his idea was technically impossible before the battlefield proved otherwise. In Part 4, we go back to the beginning. Before Villers-Bocage, before Total Eyes, before Joe Ekins ever climbed into a Firefly turret. We examine how the 17-pounder came to exist, who fought to put it in a Sherman when every institutional voice said it could not be done, and what the full legacy of that decision looks like when measured not in individual tank kills, but in the lives it saved on both sides of the wire. The story of Michael Wittmann ended in a burning field in Normandy. The story of what killed him is still being told. From a wheat field in Normandy to the archives of military history, this story has traveled a long distance across 4 parts. We watched Joe Ekins climb into a Firefly on August 8, 1944, press his eye to a gun sight, and destroy 3 Tiger tanks in 12 minutes. We examined the death of Michael Wittmann, the propaganda god, the Third Reich built from a farmer's son, and how that death exposed the gap between the myth of German armor and the reality of what a properly armed, properly positioned Allied crew could do. We followed the Firefly doctrine from Saint-Aignan through Canet Wood to the closing of the Falaise Pocket, watching it change the arithmetic of armored warfare one engagement at a time. But Part 3 ended with a question that the kill counts and the campaign maps cannot answer. What happened to the men behind this story when the guns finally stopped? What does a 21-year-old gunner from a shoe factory do with the knowledge that he almost certainly killed the most famous tank commander in the German military? And what is the true legacy of a weapon that the British military establishment initially dismissed as technically impossible? Because there is one final twist to this story, and almost nobody knows it. Joe Ekins went home. That is the beginning and the end of his post-war story, and it is told most honestly in its simplicity. He returned to Rushden. He married the woman he had met during regimental training in Gloucester. He went back to work in the leather trade, the same industry, the same town, the same rhythms of ordinary English working life he had left when he volunteered in 1942. He put himself through night school while holding down full-time work, rose to factory manager within 4 years, and spent the next 3 decades doing the job well before retiring. He had 2 grandchildren. He lived in the same community his entire life. He was never formally decorated for what he did on August 8, 1944. No medal was awarded for the 3 Tigers. The regimental system credited kills to the vehicle and the crew collectively, and the ambiguity over which tank was actually Tiger 007 meant that even the historical record remained contested for decades. Ekins himself never sought recognition. When journalists and historians began finding him in the 1980s and 1990s, as the forensic debate over Wittmann's death moved from German veterans' publications into mainstream military history, he received them with the same blunt equanimity he brought to everything. He answered their questions. He did not embellish. He stated what he knew, acknowledged what he could not know for certain, and offered his personal assessment of Wittmann, with the directness of a man who had processed the moral weight of what he had done across many decades and arrived at a settled conclusion. He was asked once whether he felt anything when he learned years after the war the identity of the man most likely killed in Tiger 007. He said that he had done his job. That Wittmann had done his job for a cause Ekins believed to be wrong. That war was not a place for sentiment about the men on the other side of the gun sight. He was not cold about it. He was clear about it, which is a different thing entirely, and probably a healthier one. In the year 2000, when Ekins was 78 years old, he was invited to the Tank Museum at Bovington, the same place where he had trained on the Firefly decades earlier, and was given the opportunity to fire the main gun of a Challenger 2 battle tank, the British Army's frontline armored vehicle at the time. He hit the target with his first round. Museum staff reportedly said he became the oldest person ever to fire a Challenger 2 in service. The hand was steadier than anyone had a right to expect. The eye behind the sight was the same eye that had lined up tigers across a Norman wheat field in the summer heat of 1944. He died on February 1, 2012, at the age of 88. He was buried in Rushden, the town he had never really left. The men who crewed the other vehicles in that engagement found quieter endings too. Sergeant Gordon, the Firefly commander, who was wounded or incapacitated in the engagement and had to be replaced by Lieutenant James mid-battle, survived the war. Lieutenant James, who ran across open ground under direct Tiger fire to climb into a tank that had just been hit by an 88mm round, received no special commendation for that act of courage beyond what the regimental records preserved. Major Sidney Radley Walters of the Sherbrooke Fusiliers. The man who held his crews in position with the word, hold off, as Tigers rolled toward the chateau wall, continued to serve with distinction, eventually retiring from the Canadian Army and living into his 90s, one of the longest surviving senior officers of the Normandy campaign. Balthazar Wall, Bobby Wall Wittmann's longtime gunner, his best man. The other half of the famous partnership that German propaganda had built into a symbol of SS martial supremacy, survived the war in hospital, recovering from wounds suffered in an Allied bombing raid before August 8th. He lived until 1996. He never publicly discussed the day Wittmann died in any detail that historians have been able to verify. Some silences are complete. The technical legacy of what happened at Saint-Aignan on August 8, 1944, is considerably easier to trace than the emotional one, and the numbers are worth sitting with for a moment. The Sherman Firefly served in frontline British and Commonwealth armored units from its combat debut in June 1944 through the end of the war in Europe in May 1945. Approximately 2,100 Firefly conversions were completed in total, though the precise number varies by source depending on how prototype and training vehicles are counted. In 11 months of combat, Firefly-equipped troops were involved in the destruction of documented German armor across France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Germany itself. The 17-pounder gun in all its configurations, towed anti-tank self-propelled, and the Firefly turret mount is conservatively credited with being the primary weapon system responsible for defeating more German Panther and Tiger armor in the Western theater than any other single Allied anti-tank weapon. Again, the principle the Firefly demonstrated did not die with the Third Reich. After 1945, virtually every major armored power in the world revised its tank gun doctrine in response to the lessons of Normandy. The fundamental insight that a medium tank chassis could and should carry the most powerful gun available, rather than a compromise weapon chosen for weight or crew comfort, became the foundation of post-war tank design. The Soviet T-54 carried a 100mm gun on a medium chassis. The British Centurion, which entered service in 1945 and fought in Korea, eventually carried the 105mm L7 gun, a weapon that could engage and defeat virtually any armor it was likely to encounter. The American M60 and the later Abrams carried successively more powerful guns on what were essentially medium tank platforms. The Challenger 2 that Joe Ekins fired in 2000 carries a 120mm rifled gun on a chassis that owes its design philosophy in a direct line of descent to the argument that the Firefly had settled in the wheatfields of Normandy. The gun wins, the armor follows. That is the lesson, and it is still being applied in armored vehicle programs in 2024. The Firefly also changed how military establishments think about weapons conversion and adaptation under wartime pressure. The conversion program, taking an existing American medium tank, modifying the turret to accept a British gun that was technically too large for the original design, solving the ammunition storage problem by relocating rounds from a hull sponson to an external bin, and doing all of this while simultaneously supplying a frontline army in the middle of the largest amphibious operation in history, was a logistics and engineering achievement that military historians have consistently underrated because it produced no dramatic narrative. Nobody invented the Firefly in a flash of genius. It was ground out in workshops and committee rooms by men whose names are mostly absent from the histories, solving problems that the institutional establishment had declared unsolvable, making it work because the alternative was sending men to die in tanks they all knew were not adequate for the fight. The deeper lesson is about that institutional resistance. The proposal to mount the 17-pounder in a Sherman was resisted at multiple levels and for multiple reasons: weight distribution concerns, turret ring diameter limitations. The argument that the gun's breech was simply too large to fit in the available space. Every objection was technically legitimate. Every objection was also eventually overcome. The gap between "this cannot be done given current parameters" and "this cannot be done" is one that military establishments and organizations of all kinds consistently fail to navigate. The parameters are treated as fixed. The constraints are treated as permanent. And the result is that innovations which could save lives and change outcomes are delayed by months or years while the bureaucratic process works through its stages of denial. This pattern repeats across the history of military technology with a consistency that is almost dispiriting. The tank itself was considered an impractical gimmick by senior British cavalry officers when it was proposed in 1915. Radar was dismissed by significant portions of the RAF establishment in the early 1930s as too complex and unreliable for operational use. The proximity fuse, arguably the single most effective piece of American ordnance innovation of the entire Second World War, was initially rejected by artillery commanders, who considered it a solution to a problem they did not believe they had. In each case, the innovation eventually forced its way through. In each case, the delay cost lives that did not need to be lost. And in each case, the people who were eventually proven right were the ones who kept pushing against the institutional wall rather than accepting the verdict of the first committee that reviewed their proposal. Joe Ekins was not an innovator, he was the end user. The man who sat behind the gun that other people had fought to build, argued to deploy, and trained him to use. But his story and the Firefly's story are inseparable because they make the same point from different directions. The weapon was only as good as the man who aimed it. The man was only as effective as the weapon he was given. Get both right, The right gun and the right person disciplined enough to wait for the right moment, and you can kill a legend. Now for the detail that most accounts of this story stop short of including. When Brian Reed's forensic reanalysis of the Tiger 007 wreck was published in 2005, arguing that the fatal penetration struck the left side of Wittmann's tank and therefore implicated the Sherbrooke Fusiliers, rather than Joe Ekins, it generated significant debate in military history circles. The first Northamptonshire Yeomanry's war diary listing 007 as Ekins' third kill was re-examined. German survivor accounts were cross-referenced with wreck photographs, and a conclusion emerged that most popular accounts still have not fully absorbed. It is almost certain that Ekins destroyed 3 Tigers in 12 minutes. It is also quite possible that the third tank he hit and logged as 007 was actually Tiger 009. Helmut Dollinger's command vehicle, which bore a similar number and was engaged at almost the same time in the same general engagement zone. The real Tiger 007 carrying Wittmann and his 4 crewmen was most likely killed by a Sherbrooke Fusilier Sherman at the Chateau of Gomerville, at a range of perhaps 300 meters, by a gun that the German military had specifically designed its propaganda around dismissing as harmless. Michael Wittmann, Knight's Cross Oak Leaves Swords, the man Hitler decorated at the Wolf's Lair, the face on the newsreels, the propaganda symbol of Aryan military supremacy, was almost certainly killed by a standard Sherman tank at close range. Not by a Firefly, not by a specialized weapon. By the exact machine the Third Reich had spent years telling its soldiers and its public to treat with contempt. If there is a more complete collapse of a military myth, history does not record it easily. From a shoe factory in Northamptonshire, Joseph Ekins became the man history most associates with killing the greatest tank ace the Third Reich ever produced. And the full truth of what actually happened is even more humiliating to the German propaganda machine than the version they tried to suppress. The ordinary Sherman, crewed by ordinary men, fired the fatal shot. The Tiger was not invincible, the Sherman was not helpless, and the men who crewed Allied tanks across the fields of Normandy, factory workers and farmhands, shoe stitchers and school teachers, citizens who had been handed a weapon and told to learn how to use it, were never the inferior soldiers that German propaganda needed the world to believe they were. If you know a story like this one, a forgotten innovation, an overlooked soldier, a moment where ordinary people change the course of extraordinary events, share it in the comments. These stories deserve to be told, and there are more of them than any single channel can cover. Every week we go looking for the ones that the official histories buried under the names of generals and the statistics of campaigns. Subscribe, and you will find them with us. The Tiger burned. The legend died. The shoe factory worker went home. And that, in the end, is the only history that was ever real.